The air is thick. It presses against the skin like something alive. The sky above the valley is not the sky you know. It is vast and pale and wrong somehow, filtered through a canopy of water vapor that hangs over the entire earth like a second atmosphere, softening the light into something ancient and unnatural. The ground trembles slightly, not from an earthquake, from footsteps. Something is coming through the tree line, and the men standing at the edge of the settlement already know it is not one of them. They know it from the shadow that falls over them before the figure emerges. They know it from the silence that precedes it. Every animal in the valley has gone quiet. The figure steps into the open, and the men look up, and further up still. The being stands twice the height of the tallest man among them, its grey skin catching the filtered light, its eyes pale and luminous in a face that is almost human, but carries something ancient behind it, something that has looked at the stars from a place much closer than the earth. These are the Nephilim, not legend, not metaphor. According to the oldest texts humanity has ever preserved, they walked here, they built here, they corrupted here, and according to two words buried in Genesis that almost no translation renders correctly, they returned. Genesis chapter 6 opens with a passage that the mainstream church has never fully resolved. Verse 1 states that when human beings began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took as wives any they chose. Verse 4 then introduces a word that has generated more scholarly controversy than almost any other in the entire Hebrew canon. The word is Nephilim. Most English translations render it as giants. The King James Bible uses giants. The New International Version uses Nephilim without translation, acknowledging that the word carries meaning that the single English equivalent cannot contain. Verse 4 continues, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." The passage then ends. It moves on. It does not explain who the sons of God were. It does not explain what Nephilim means at its root. It does not explain what happened to them. It does not explain the phrase that carries the entire weight of this investigation. And also afterward, that phrase is the gap. That gap is what the rest of this video fills. The Book of Enoch was not lost. It was removed. The distinction matters enormously. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved it in its biblical canon continuously since at least the 4th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran between 1947 and 1956, contained multiple copies of the Book of Enoch, indicating that the community at Qumran considered it scripture of the highest order. These are two independent preservation traditions, geographically and institutionally separated, both protecting the same text across more than 2,000 years. The Book of Enoch provides what Genesis chapter 6 withholds. It names the sons of God. They are the Watchers, a class of angelic being assigned to observe humanity. Their leader is named Semiaza. The text names 200 of them who descended to the summit of Mount Hermon, a specific and verifiable geographical location in the northern Levant. The Hebrew root of the name Hermon is Cherem, meaning devoted to destruction or under a ban. The mountain's name itself encodes the nature of what happened there. Enoch chapter 6 states that these 200 beings swore an oath on that summit, binding themselves together in their decision to take human wives and produce offspring. The Hebrew word for Nephilim comes from the root naphol, meaning to fall, to be cast down, or to cause others to fall. This is not incidental. The English translation Giants loses everything. It describes only the physical scale of the offspring. The Hebrew root describes their origin, their nature, and their trajectory simultaneously. The fallen ones, the ones who cause falling, the ones descended from those who fell. A giant is merely large. A Nephilim is something entirely different. The Book of Enoch chapter 7 describes the offspring in specific numerical terms. The Nephilim grew to 300 cubits in height. A cubit is approximately 18 inches. 300 cubits is approximately 450 feet. This number has been debated, and some manuscripts give different figures. But the consistent element across all versions is the extraordinary scale. Beings of a physical magnitude that dwarfed the human population entirely. Enoch chapter 6 names the individual watchers beyond Semyaza: Azazel, Armaros, Barakel, Kokabel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Sarakiel, Asael, Armas, Batral, Anane, Zakebe, Samsapil, Etael, Turel, Yomiel, Araziel. These are not symbolic figures. They are named beings with specific assigned domains of forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught men to make swords and shields, how to work metal into weapons of war. He taught women the art of adornment, bracelets, ornaments, the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids. Barakel taught astrology. Kogebel taught the constellations. Tamiel taught astronomy. Amaros taught the resolution of enchantments. The Book of Jubilees, a second ancient text preserved in its complete form only in the Ethiopian biblical Canaan, confirms and expands this account. It states that the Watchers were sent to earth originally to instruct the children of men in doing judgment and uprightness on the earth. The corruption of that original mandate is what the flood was sent to address. The Nephilim offspring, born of the union between these beings and human women, consumed everything around them. Enoch chapter 7 dates that they ate the labor of all the sons of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, they turned against the men themselves, then against birds, beasts, and reptiles. The word the text uses for this indiscriminate consumption is significant. They devoured one another's flesh and drank the blood. This is not described as moral failure in isolation. It is described as the natural consequence of a biological category that had no place in the created order. Look at what 3 independent ancient civilizations recorded about this era. Civilizations with no contact routes during their foundational periods, and the convergence becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The Sumerians of Mesopotamia preserved records of beings called the Anunnaki, which translates roughly as those who came from the heavens to earth. The Anunnaki in Sumerian texts are described as giant, luminous, capable of interbreeding with human women, and responsible for transmitting advanced knowledge of agriculture, law, and metalworking to humanity. The Sumerian king list records pre-flood rulers with reigns extending tens of thousands of years, life spans utterly incompatible with normal human biology. The ancient Egyptians preserved accounts of the Neteru, a class of divine beings who ruled Egypt before the pharaohs, described in the Turin king list as the followers of Horus and the Shemsu Hor. These beings were described as physically enormous, as teachers of the arts of civilization, and as beings whose bloodline mixed with the human line to produce the earliest dynasties. The ancient Greeks preserved accounts of the Titans, offspring of the union between divine beings and human women, who were eventually bound beneath the earth following a war with the Olympian gods. The Greek word for this binding is tart karu, the same concept rendered in the New Testament book of 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, where the angels who sinned are described as cast down to Tartarus. and committed to chains of gloomy darkness. Not coincidence, not borrowing. 3 civilizations separated by geography and founding period, describing the same pattern with identical structural elements. Divine beings descend, they interbreed, they transmit forbidden knowledge, they produce giants, they are eventually bound or destroyed, and the world is reshaped by what they left behind. Genesis chapter 6 verse 12 uses the Hebrew phrase kol basar, meaning all flesh, to describe what had been corrupted on the earth. God looked on the earth and saw that kol basar had corrupted its way. This is not simply a description of moral wickedness. Kol basar refers to all biological matter, all living flesh. The corruption being described is biological as well as moral. A contamination of the genetic order that had been written into creation from the beginning. The Book of Jasher, referenced by name in the canonical books of Joshua and 2 Samuel, and therefore acknowledged as a real historical text by the Hebrew scriptures themselves, adds a detail that Genesis compresses into a single phrase. Jasher chapter 4 states that the sons of men in those days took from the cattle of the earth, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air, and taught the mixture of animals of one species with the other, in order therewith to provoke the Lord. This is species mixing. This is the crossing of the biological boundaries written into the original creation order. The violence that Genesis chapter 6 verse 11 describes filling the earth was not merely human war. It was the consequence of a world whose biological architecture had been deliberately destabilized. The Nephilim did not simply conquer the earth by force. They corrupted its foundations. The divine response came through 4 archangels. Enoch chapter 10 names them: Sariel, Raphael, Gabriel, and Michael. Each received a specific assignment. Sariel was sent to warn Noah, the one man whose genealogy the text of Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 describes using a very specific Hebrew phrase. The phrase is tamim, in his generations, meaning complete or unblemished in his generations, in his bloodlines. The word tamim is the same word used elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures to describe sacrificial animals that are without defect, genetically pure, uncontaminated. Noah's distinction was not merely moral. His bloodline had remained uncontaminated by the Nephilim mixing. Raphael was instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness of the desert of Dudael. The text specifies that Azazel is to remain bound there until the day of judgment, covered with rough and jagged rocks, kept in darkness, never again to see the light. Gabriel was sent against the Nephilim offspring themselves, to destroy the children of the watchers from among men, to send them out against one another, so that they would destroy each other in mutual slaughter. Michael was given the most precise assignment to bind Semyaza and the rest of the named watchers in the valleys of the earth, to imprison them under the hills for 70 generations. Enoch chapter 13 records Enoch himself being sent to the watchers as a messenger to deliver the judgment. There will be no peace for you. Enoch chapter 14 describes his vision of the divine throne room, which he was permitted to enter as a witness to the pronouncement against the watchers. The flood itself was the instrument for cleansing what remained after the Nephilim had destroyed each other. It was not the primary act of judgment. It was the conclusion of it. Here is the phrase that changes everything. Return to Genesis chapter 6 verse 4. Most translations read, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." The Hebrew behind "and also afterward" is 2 words. Vegam acharei ken. Vegam means "and also," or "and moreover." Acharei ken means "after this," or "after these things." The standard reading treats this as a parenthetical. The Nephilim existed before the flood. and by the way, also after it, because the same process of sons of God taking human wives continued. But the specificity of vegam acharei ken is more deliberate than a parenthetical. The text is making a declaration. After the flood, after the judgment, after the binding of the watchers, and the destruction of the first Nephilim, the pattern continued. The post-flood biblical record confirms it. Numbers chapter 13 records the 12 spies sent into Canaan by Moses returning with a report. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak who come from the Nephilim. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. Anak is named. His descendants are identified as Nephilim. After the flood, Deuteronomy chapter 2 names 3 post-flood populations carrying this lineage: the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Anakim. The Rephaim are described as tall as the Anakim. 1 Samuel chapter 17 places Goliath, a descendant of the Rephaim, standing 6 cubits and a span, approximately 9 feet and 9 inches tall, at the valley of Elah. The pattern the Watchers initiated before the flood did not end with the flood. The bloodline survived. Jesus of Nazareth, speaking in Matthew chapter 24 verse 37, used a specific framing for what would characterize the period preceding his return. As it was in the days of Noah. He did not say as it was in the days of Sodom. He did not say as it was in the days of the judges. He named the specific era that the Book of Enoch and Genesis chapter 6 describe: the era of the Nephilim, the corruption of biological order, the mixing of what was created to be separate. What changes when you see this clearly is not what you believe. What changes is what you are able to read. The post-flood biblical record is populated with beings carrying a lineage that the flood was meant to end. The spies in Canaan were not exaggerating. David was not fighting a tall man with a javelin. The battles of the conquest of Canaan were not simply territorial wars. They were the continuation of a judgment that began in Enoch chapter 10, executed partially through the flood, and left deliberately unfinished. Because vegam acharei, Ken tells you the pattern returned. The recognition principle is simply this: you cannot identify what you have not named. The ancient texts name it. The cross-civilization evidence confirms the name. The post-flood record documents the continuation. Those who name the pattern are not making a claim about the present. They are reading the ancient texts the way the ancient texts were designed to be read, as a continuous record of a conflict that the flood interrupted but did not end.